Um, Good morning. This is a joint meeting of the House and Senate Transportation Committees. Um, and I, what we wanted to do from the Senate side, we've been taking a fair amount of testimony on local option taxes. And the senator from Washington and myself, what kind of started this off is we were in a community that presently has the 1% local option tax in place. That community is now voting in March on going from 1% to 2% on the local option tax. And in the backdrop, in our afternoon committees, the two of us, we sit on appropriations, and in appropriations in the pilot fund where the 25% that goes to the state is deposited, right now there's a surplus. And the administration has recommended in their budget to move a couple of pieces out of that surplus and paying for items within the tax department. The league is not very happy with that and sees that pot of money in the local option taxes as money for the towns. So as we had those conversations and we began to dig into the issue of what the local option taxes are and where they go in towns, we decided that we would dig in and we'd take a look and see what was what we might do with that to create something for the towns that was more consistent and formula-based to send money back. The only place there is formulas to send money back to the towns is in transportation. And on the municipal side of government, for many smaller towns, the transportation budget is 70 to 75% of their municipal budget. Fast forward to that, and we took testimony yesterday from one of the towns that I represent, Morristown, who is putting up a local option tax. And that local option tax, they will vote on in March. Of the 1.2 that they estimate to raise, 800,000 of it is going to be dedicated just for paving, not for bridges, not for anything else, but dedicated for paving for the next 4 to 5 years for them to catch up to a place where I think 60% of their roads would be in good condition. So and we've taken all kinds of testimonies. So I'm giving a little overview to all of this. The nexus for us with local option is that it's money raised at the local level. If there's a surplus there and the numbers produce some extra money, is there a way that we could find to dedicate that money to go back to help the towns in a organized fashion and not as we're doing in the pilot fund, send a little here, send a little there, all over the place. So the joint fiscal staff will be here today to kind of give you a primer and bring you up to speed on some of the things that we have heard in our committee. And you can do what you want from that point on. But we know that there is an interest within your committee, as there is in ours, of doing something constructive for the towns. So at this point, Chris, you're on.
Sure. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Chris Stewart from the Joint Fiscal Office. I'm going to be brief and then turn it over to some of my colleagues, but I just wanted to sort of kick things off with just a few framing remarks about leading into this conversation to try to make sense of it. I apologize to the Senate members here. A lot of this is going to be a repeat of what you heard last week, but this will be new content for the House members, and it's great to see you all here listening to this jointly. So, I think as Senator Westman mentioned, this is really intended to be the starting point of a conversation around potential strategies to wrestle with this fiscal challenge that you all are very familiar with, which is that the T fund is severely constrained and struggles to keep up with federal match needs, let alone coming up with additional revenues to provide aid to the municipalities. At the same time, our municipalities are struggling with the same cost pressures and property tax pressures that you all are very familiar with. One of the things I think is worth keeping in mind, and I know you all know this, but it's worth remembering, is that our transportation system really is a network. And when we all go to work or go anywhere, we cross town lines, we go on interstate highways, state highways, class 2 roads, class 3 roads, and towns have different abilities to keep up with their sections of that network. And they also have very different cost pressures. Not every town can raise a lot of money through a local option tax, but some towns really struggle to keep up with the mileage that they have. So is there a way to create a system where towns can generate local resources and also have some of those resources spread to support the network that benefits everybody, but not every town can really raise the same amount of money to take care of the same amount of mileage? So I think those are sort of the goals that this conversation was attempting to further. I did just want to remind everybody that we do have an existing law around 1% local option taxes. So we're going to split this conversation today. My colleague Ted Barnett, who the Transportation Committee has never seemed to hear from because he's always hiding in Ways and Means, is going to walk you through a overview on what the current law is on the 1% local option tax. So that'll be some good foundational grounding in what is currently in place. Then Damian Leonard from Ledge Council is going to go through a draft proposal, again, to start a conversation that deals specifically with the towns that Senator Westman mentioned that might be interested in going to a 2% local option tax. So that piece will deal specifically with that second 1%. So the language you'll see doesn't change current law. The first 1% that's already in place, it really deals with towns who are looking to go a little bit higher up. So as Senator Westman mentioned, I think the proposal would have, again, this is all starting point, would split the revenue. So the town that generates the local option tax revenue through its commercial activity would keep 50% of the money, 40% of the money would then essentially be run through existing town highway programs like the town highway aid formula, and 10% would go to the pilot special fund. So with that, sort of kicking off the context around this conversation, I'll invite my colleague Ted Barnett to come up, and he has some slides that goes through current law on local option tax. But I know many of you in this room have been interested in tools like this. This is something that does leverage an existing tax type. We already have a lot of the administrative infrastructure in place to do this type of thing. So also just keep that in mind as a second. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and talk at the same time. We'll see how well that goes. So Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal office. It is great to be in front of different committees, mix things up a little bit. Generally in a session, I try and get in front of as many committees as possible, so thank you for helping me achieve that. So yes, as folks have set the table, this is a general primer on local option taxes. We're gonna talk about local option taxes themselves, the 1%, where the revenue goes into the pilot special fund and allocations. And then talk a little bit high level of general tax policy considerations when thinking about different tax types, who bears the responsibility for paying the tax, et cetera. So that's where we're going to go. Okay, so local option taxes. The authority for local option taxes is found in 24 VSA 138. The lawyers, folks at Ledge Council will probably spend a lot more time on that than I will. Towns can place a 1% local option tax on any combination of sales, meals and alcoholic beverages, and rooms. And folks do, you will see, folks do implement any sort of combination of those. This was originally created as a mechanism to help municipalities transition to the statewide property tax created by Act 60 of 1997. As part of that legislation, there was specific towns called out, referred to as gold towns, that met certain property tax criteria or criteria on the grand list. And originally, local option taxes were envisioned to sunset in 2002. That sunset kept getting pushed back, and now we have a structure that is permanently in statute. Before Act 144 of 2024, folks who weren't called out as gold towns were required to do a charter change and get approval from you all to implement a local option tax. Now, a lot can be implemented by a majority of voters in the municipality after it's been approved by the select board to go on the ballot. However, we'll talk about this at the end of the presentation. Implementing a new local option tax can be administratively burdensome for the Department of Taxes. So Act 144 allows the Commissioner of Taxes to limit the number of new local option towns to 5 per year. If they determine that the slate that's coming through in a particular year would be too cumbersome for them to administer. Local option taxes are collected and administered by the Department of Taxes. There are 2 separate ones, which I'll talk about in the next slide, Burlington and Rutland City, that operate differently. But for the rest of municipalities, these are implemented at the statewide, or collected and administered at the statewide level. State law apportions the revenue from the local option tax, 75% to the town that implements the lot, and then 25% to the pilot special fund. The Department of Taxes collects a per return fee to help administer the program. Also, it helps fund the state appraisal mitigation program. A return is filed when a business reports their monthly or quarterly sales or rooms taxes to the department. This was a question last time, so I'll answer it now. That $5.96 return fee was lowered from $9 in 2011, so it's been around for a while. Revenue allocations changed from 70%, 30% split to the current 75-25 last year, Act 57. That was effective in October 1st. With an asterisk, there are in municipalities that have a local option tax on the sales tax, that applies to jet fuel sales. And so in Act 57, although the general local option tax percentage was changed from 70-30 to 75-25, Act 57 left these local option taxes alone, so that split of 70-30 stayed in place for jet fuel sales. The full amount of the local option tax, both the municipal and the state portion, must be used for aviation related purposes. And so yes, there are two municipalities that generate local option sales taxes on jet fuel, South Burlington, and then Berlin just started with a local option tax, and so Knapp State Airport sells Jet A, and so they are also generating local option taxes on jet fuel. It's not a large amount of money. In FY 25, the T-fund portion of local option taxes on jet fuel generated a little bit less than $10,000. This is a slide with the asterisk about our two special municipalities that received authority in their town charters to implement local option taxes that are collected at the municipal level rather than the Department of Taxes. And so they hold on to 100% of that revenue because they are the ones collecting and administering it. In Burlington, this is referred to as the gross receipts tax, and it is levied at 2.5% on admissions, alcoholic beverages, amusements, and meals. A lot of those categories, when you're looking at the charter, seem, refer to amusements, or some of it is kind of older school businesses, and then hotels and motels, it's a 4% tax on those businesses, and then short-term rentals, 9%. That rate is much higher. Burlington sharply regulates their short-term rentals, and so that's a tax policy that's a bit of that piece to discourage short-term rentals. In Burlington, in Rutland City, it's called the Rooms, Meals, and Entertainment Tax, and it's 1% on the gross receipts of specified business activity. Rooms, meals, and entertainment category. So, with the general information out of the way, moving on to revenue collections. And so this slide shares information about local option tax revenues that have been collected since fiscal year 2017. The key piece in this slide is that you'll see from 2017 to 2021, local option tax revenues collected they increased a little bit, but the rate of change wasn't quite that strong. And then after 2021, see pretty sharp ramp up in tax collections. And so since 2017, total local option tax revenues have increased by 102%. And it's important to note that of this overall share, 75% of it comes from the sales local option tax. And generally speaking, so fiscal year 25, total local option tax revenue, $56.3 million. The towns received $37 million. The pilot fund received, we'll talk more about the pilot fund in a bit, received $15.8 million in two funds that almost $90,000. And then return fees was $3.2 million. So yes, out of the $56.3 million, $42.2 million was sales local option taxes. So then,
Just a quick question. Do you know if that's due to inflation or more transactions are less when it's been going up over the years, like the cost of goods? Do you track, are there more people buying stuff out there?
sure, it's a good question. So on this slide, we're going to talk about two sources of revenue strength. Their inflation certainly plays a part. It's not on this slide, but absolutely, as there's more inflation, the cost of goods increasing, the sales and rooms and meals is levied on as a percentage of the cost of what is sold. So sure, inflation would increase its revenue collections. The two other pieces, one is there were changes in pandemic era and how people were spending money. So on the sales tax side, folks right after the pandemic weren't able to go out and spend money on services, going up to, for services. They were maybe looking around their house, they had some extra stimulus money, they were maybe deciding to buy a new couch or, so we saw in the overall economy a shift to more spending on goods. On the meals and room side, you'll see that on where my mouse is, between fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, meals and rooms taxes increased by 50%. And so once I saw a drop off right after the pandemic, folks weren't able to go out to eat, they weren't able to go on vacation. But once, for Vermont in particular, right, was able to, through effective management of the pandemic, right, they were able to open relatively quickly. And so we saw meals and rooms tax collections increase substantially. So that fed into local option tax revenue as well. And then the second piece is since, especially recently with the legislation change for Act 144, we're seeing more municipalities implement local option taxes. So in 2017, there were 17 municipalities with a meals and rooms tax, but by 2025, there were 32. The sales tax, 14 in 2027, but 25 in 2025. So as there are more municipalities with a lot, not surprising to see that local option tax revenues increased. So we're now going to pivot to the 25% of local option tax revenue that goes to the pilot special fund. The pilot special fund primarily funds the general pilot program. The ANI pilot is a separate funding stream and it compensates land. The general pilot program compensates municipalities for the insurance value of state-owned buildings, prisons, and UVM buildings, which UVM buildings are capped at $750,000 in statute. Some examples of state-owned buildings. We have 115 State Street Annex, which is, the annex might be referring to a portion of the State House. I know some folks see the 34 million and wonder how we could rebuild the State House for $34 million, but maybe it's just referring to the annex part. But also AOT buildings, town or garages, the Albert Welcome Center. So anything that's state owned, that goes on a state building inventory, and that value is translated into a pilot payment for the town. And I will spare you the details on how that payment is calculated. So the pilot payments are funded by 25% of local option tax revenue minus return fees. In fiscal year 2026, pilot payments, the general pilot payments totaled almost $11.4 million. This number does not include Newport and Springfield have special contracts for hosting correctional facilities in their towns. Importantly, pilot payments, as far as I understand, since the beginning of the pilot program, were prorated. So there wasn't enough revenue generated through local option tax to fully fund pilot payments to municipalities. And starting in fiscal year 2024, with our increase in local option tax revenue that we discussed in the previous slide, they were able to be fully funded. This slide is showing that there are more towns that receive pilot payments. It's showing a few things, but one of them is there are far more municipalities that receive pilot payments than who have a local option tax. So on the left, the different colors reflect different types of local option taxes. So the municipalities highlighted in green have sales, meals and rooms, blue only. There are only a few on here that are blue only. Have a local option tax and sales, so you can see there's the key there. And then on the right, we're showing the amount of pilot payments, and so the lighter green colors reflect relatively small pilot payments, and then as the color becomes more blue, there are larger pilot payments. The vast majority of municipalities are receiving smaller local option or pilot payments. Maybe they have some buildings on a state park, a gazebo, a lean-to, buildings that aren't generating, there's not a lot of value in those buildings, so we're not seeing large pilot payments. But municipalities with correctional facilities with, they have a state college campus in town, so Johnson and Linden. Those are receiving larger pilot payments.
Representative Pell?
Yeah, I think this, can you go over exactly how the amount of pilot, apparently, where the correctional institutions are, there's a special formula there or special, but just for a regular municipality has one of these, state, valued property, what's the calculation to figure out? Because you got at least one moving piece, how much is in the pilot program? And then, so how much what's the calculation? If you have a gazebo, how is that number determined?
Sure, what I will do is I will go over generally using my words, and then I had in the slide I presented to Senate Transportation, I figured folks may not want to get all the way in the weeds in the calculation, but I do in that slide deck have a slide that goes through the specific steps in the calculation, so I'll provide it to you all so you can review. Generally speaking, the insurance replacement value, so the value of the building, is multiplied by the CLA. So to convert that statewide value down to the grand list value at the local municipality multiplied by 1%. So you have a grand list value, grand list kind of municipal value of state-owned buildings within the town. Then, based on the amount of kind of the budget in the town, they can calculate an adjusted tax rate and then apply that adjusted tax rate to the grand list value that was calculated in the previous step. So I'll provide that on a separate slide, but that's the general mechanics of how they get to there. And it's done, the Department of Taxes calculates all those values and yeah, so they update, as far as I understand, the values are updated annually. And so they're running those calculations and then the payments go out in the late fall, early winter, November, December.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, and we didn't talk about this slide. So this gives some background on the general trend that I mentioned about how for a while pilot payments were prorated. And so on the table you can see the amount of the prorated pilot payment based on available revenues, percentage of proration, and then what the full pilot payment would have been if there was enough revenue to make those full pilot payments. And then yes, fiscal year 24, we started to see payments funded fully. Since even with fully funding pilot payments, the amount of revenue generated by local option taxes is more than is needed for pilot payments. So you'll see this purple bar reflects the ending balance in the pilot special fund. And it's increased substantially even with fully funded pilot payments. So ended at a little over 15 million at the end of fiscal year 25. I'm going to quickly run through other neighboring states that have different, right? It's easy to think that because Vermont has a specific way of doing local option taxes, that's the way it's done everywhere. That's not true. Our neighboring states have different structures of what they allow municipalities to do. And so one is Massachusetts. They have a rooms occupancy tax and a short-term rental impact fee. Municipalities can levy up to an additional 6% on that rooms occupancy tax above the statewide rate of 5.7%. Municipalities can also levy at 3% on short-term rentals as an impact fee. 35% of the revenue generated by that impact fee must be used for affordable housing in the local municipality. Of 352 municipalities in Massachusetts, 233 have a municipal local occupancy rooms tax rate, and 42 have chosen to implement the short-term rental impact fee. And similar to local option taxes in Vermont, These taxes are collected and administered by the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. New York State has a state sales tax of 4%, but they allow local counties to add up to 4.875% on top of that 4%. Counties then have different negotiating percentages that they distribute to cities within the county. When I looked at the map, it looked like the range was about 40% to like 6% of revenue that goes to specific cities in a county. Revenue is collected by the New York Department of Taxation and Finance in that structure.
Representative Thomas?
For these other state examples, what if any percentage goes from the municipality back to the state?
From the municipality back to the.
Well, so for example, like the 75-25 split here in Vermont,
Yeah.
what does that look like in other states?
I'm not sure if the what percentage the state retains of those taxes. I'll check into it, let you know. Yep. I like make enough of the notes and clear enough the minutes so I actually know what I'm supposed to be answering. Okay, and this table shows which counties have decided to implement which local sales tax rate. The vast majority of them have chosen to implement an additional 4 on top of the state 4%, so they end up at 8%. But a few have gone for the full 8.875. So moving on to some considerations on the screen. The first one is complexity. The local option tax administration is currently fairly complicated. And a big piece of this is because USPS residential addresses and zip codes don't neatly match town boundaries. So this is from fantastic testimony given by the Department of Taxes to Senate Finance all the way back in 2023. It was so good. I remembered it and remembered to snip the slide here. But the key piece is, so Montpelier has recently implemented a local option sales tax. The yellow dots reflect addresses that have a Montpelier mailing address. And so you see quite a few in Middlesex, a few in Moortown. Berlin also has a local option sales tax, but they have a Montpelier address. So when someone's making a purchase online and they're entering their address, it would show up as a Montpelier address for folks in Middlesex. And so how does the Department of Taxes get retailers the information they need to appropriately charge the local option sales tax for their customers? It's challenging. I know they do phenomenal work on it. They've developed shape files that they push out to a lot of the larger like Square or Shopify to help figure out which addresses need to be purchased tax, but it's definitely an operation. It's definitely a challenge. And so as you all are considering additional changes to the local options tax structure broadly, keeping complexity in administration in mind is absolutely important.
Representative Pouch has another question.
You mentioned that Burlington and Rutland, they collect their own. So, and so instead of the money coming to the state, it goes directly to those municipalities and they get a monthly payment or whatever. Is that how it works?
Yes, businesses are submitting, the municipalities have their own returns and businesses within the municipalities are submitting the returns to the municipal treasurer. And that's happening at that level.
Okay.
Yep. The second piece is equity, and when we're talking about equity, this is often thinking about who pays and who is bearing either a larger or smaller responsibility for a specific tax type. For local option taxes, one thing I didn't mention in the map but a lot of local option taxes are implemented where commercial activity occurs. So this is towns with a large tourism presence, a large commercial base from retailers. And so they will benefit the most, regardless, this may be independent of their population, thinking about Berlin as an example. That is not universally true in Vermont. There are a lot of municipalities that would not see much revenue if they implemented a local option tax. Maybe they have a single gas station in town. There might even be less than that.
Yeah.
So thinking about in terms of equity, they use the example of myself, I live in Williamstown, and Berlin, Montpelier, Barry all have some version of a local option tax. And so as myself as a Williamstown resident, I'm spending my money in those towns. They're the ones who are generating or receiving local option tax revenue. But Williamstown also, if we're talking about paving, has some paved miles. And so, right, like thinking through who is paying local option taxes and who's receiving the revenue is a piece to think through on the equity side. Another piece of this is different tax types are paid by different groups of folks. And so when thinking about the rooms tax is far and away paid by out-of-state visitors, so folks coming here from neighboring states, internationally. But sales, meals, and alcohol taxes, more of a split. Residents are going out to eat, they're buying goods at local retailers, but the same is true for tourists who are coming here and spending money in local businesses. The final piece is just very broadly speaking, consumption taxes more broadly, and specifically sales taxes are regressive, meaning that folks who, so it makes up sales tax, since lower income folks and younger folks are spending more of their overall income on goods, the amount of tax they're paying on those goods make a larger percentage of their income than folks who are higher up the income scale. And then finally, when considering, particularly in the structure, an increase in taxation, a key piece is to think through how this might place Vermont compared to local or neighboring jurisdictions. So in the sales tax, Vermont is currently at 6%. With a local option tax, it would move in towns that currently have a local option tax at 7%. If they're able to implement an additional 1%, that would move sales taxes in certain jurisdictions to 8%. And so that starts to move ahead of some neighboring states. When I looked, New England states generally have a sales tax rate of between 5.5% and 7%. So that would, certainly move Vermont in those jurisdictions if they did implement an additional 1% beyond neighboring states. Vermont currently has the highest meals tax among neighboring states. So again, increases would push Vermont ahead of neighbors. I will note that when thinking about competitiveness on the lodging side, it's more complicated. A lot of jurisdictions and cities in particular have local tax rates, local surcharges, paying for convention center, all sorts of other things. And so these comparisons are challenging, but similarly, in New Hampshire and Maine are certainly, when folks are looking at a vacation in New England in the woods, they're certainly looking at the tax rates in New Hampshire and Maine on the lodging side is important. And so overall, increases in local option taxes in certain jurisdictions would move those places above comparable locations in other states in a pure competitiveness lens. So there we go.
Then what?
Thank you. I just had two questions from a little bit earlier. The first, you mentioned that the tax department has the ability to limit how many local option taxes they allow in the state. Just aware, at least one of my towns has that on the ballot for town meeting. Any sense of how many towns are looking at this year, and could we run into a situation where towns pass local option taxes and the tax department says we can't handle all those?
So I can, so we took testimony. At this point, their tracking document has 7 communities that this year have it on the ballot. I think they have 14 towns that have inquiries in about moving ahead. To this point, they do have permission to not allow more than 5, but the tax department to this point has never implemented or enforced any of that to this point.
Thank you. And then my second question was, you spoke of that we are fully paying the pilot program, but that we weren't fully paying it in the past. Is that legislation that changed? Like, how is this, how are we not fully paying pilot funds back to municipalities in the past?
Sure. So it was explicitly because there wasn't enough revenue being generated by local option taxes. And so every year, and looking at some of the spreadsheets I started in 2023, so I caught a small window of how this was done. They were after town meeting day, as part of the budget process, looking at, based on the current number of local option taxes, seeing who had implemented a new local option tax, looking at the consensus revenue forecast, putting together an estimated amount of local option tax revenue, and then basing the pilot appropriation on a conservative amount under that estimated revenue to make sure, right, you weren't overspending on the fund, but it was explicitly limited by the amount of revenue. So there was about it looked like a $2.5 to $2 million difference, that delta, and so yes, it was just within the budgetary process, trying to maximize what municipalities were able to get, but also so this wasn't.
Representative Morris.
Oh, and
Oh,
then
sorry.
yeah, Senator White.
You have Rep White, you have Senator White, that's clarity right there. Well, thank you, Ted, so much. It was nice to see that again. And I felt like I had like an open book test a little bit because I knew some of the answers. But I think the main question that I have that I don't think your presentation answers is how much money we actually would be gaining from a second percentage on Stowe, how long it would take us to see that revenue, and then an actual comparison of what is the gap we have, which to my understanding is 33 million plus, and how that would even fit into it other than a couple nickels and dimes for resolving the problem. So I guess I'm wondering if you could give me some information about what the expected revenue would be, and maybe Damien will go over it with the language, but what would the expected revenue be for the construct that we heard from Senator Westman, and how long would it take for that money to actually go to town highway aid?
So to answer the first part, if we're looking only at Stowe,
Yeah, and that's if my understanding is correct, that's the only town that's doing this hypothetically this March. I believe this is the only town that's doing a second.
That's the only town that has it up for a vote
Okay.
this time.
But they haven't passed it.
And
Yeah.
you know, and that's a trickier question because Burlington already pre-existing did have higher amounts, but given the law the way it is, the Stowe is the first community out of the box that has a vote this year
Okay,
or this March.
yeah, so yeah,
so there are two different ways to look at it when I went through the data. One is kind of the low end. An additional 1% in Stowe would be about $3.5 million. That's not including, there's a portion of the data that's referred to as other, which as far as I understand, refers to a lot of online sales. If you include that, it's about $4.3 million. So that's the
total
general
amount.
range, the total amount of local option tax revenue.
And the way the construct is for Senator Westman's bill is 50% goes back to the town. So that would bring us down to like 1.8 million going to the town. I'm really bad at math. So that would be half of that would go to the town, and then 40% would go to the town highway aid fund. So and then 10% would go to the state pilot fund. So what would that 40, maybe you can just quick math it for me?
Oh,
That would be like,
I don't.
that would be like 900, it'd be like 900 to a 1.5 million.
Yeah, so
right?
if you're looking,
Is that-
let's say hypothetically it's 4 million,
Yeah.
and then you could do two.
Yep,
Would be two would go to Stowe, two would go to state uses, and then whatever, 0.4, I'm bad at math.
so yeah, so under 2 million is what we would expect,
Yeah.
like big bold numbers going to town highway aid,
Yes, and.
if they pass it.
Yes, broadly speaking, and I don't,
Okay.
yes, and given that I'm sure the tech department would have thoughts on how soon it could be implemented, but it's put in an effective date. The lift since Stowe already has a local option tax, I imagine you can start seeing that revenue in the next fiscal year 27.
In 2027.
Yeah.
Okay, so you could see it July 2027. Yeah, that's a pretty small amount of money for potentially the amount of work. And I also think if I was Stowe and I knew that the secondary percent wouldn't be 75-25, but it would be 50-40-10, I would feel less incentive to vote for it as an individual, personally, if that was on my town ballot. So I do think this is an intriguing idea, but I worry about the amount of money being so small for this year. So thank you for that. And yeah, I guess I'll save my questions for Damien about the language then. And I also did, when I saw this on the agenda, I also thought we might be talking about what the House proposal around the gas tax was. I know they have a local option gas tax conversation that they've been having. So I'm wondering if we could do another joint hearing on this topic and hear about that idea as well.
We can talk with the chair of the committee and be happy to hear back. This is meant to bring people up to speed on where we are, what is happening out there. And I would just say in this, if we have an idea that going forward, we wanted to do something for some of the other towns that are feeders for those. In a lot of these communities, I'll take one not close to me. Stratton is a community of under 1,000 people. Stratton, a majority of the people that make Stratton work are people that live outside of Stratton. And in many communities, that's the same thing. If we're going to create a balance between communities where the host community gets a good chunk, but also the communities that are the feeder communities around that get some, and we have communities that are around them that may not have the option to do a local option tax. I think if we don't start something before a whole bunch of towns move into this area, we'll never do. So this is an attempt to look at the local option tax and create a conversation. And if some of it the House liked and wanted to do something in conjunction, I'd be happy personally about that. But this is meant to create a conversation, and you can add to it, subtract from it, whatever you. I think there's an opportunity to have a conversation now that if we wait, there won't be any opportunity to have a conversation.
Yeah, and I would just also say, I do hope that we can have a joint hearing around the gas tax conversation, because I know that that's been coming up quite a bit on the House side around local taxes. And I would also hope we have a conversation about purchase and use, because that all factors into how I feel about this proposal.
You had a hand over here.
We're coming over to Representative Burke, I think now. Sure.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Right. Just for your discussion, I had a bill that my town wanted me to put in, meaning trying to get some local money out of the gasoline stations in town. So that was 8766, which put a tax on a local option tax on gas stations. But I'm understanding that that would be very expensive to set up. It would require setting up a whole new tax system. So I don't know if that's still, in the works. It might be helpful to just know what that cost might be. But my question is, if a town wanted to adopt a local option tax that already has, like my town has local option taxes on all the three possibilities, could you say, could you just go to one? For instance, you'd say, well, we have local option tax on rooms and meals and alcohol and on sales. Could the town just decide to go to 2% on one of those items? Or would you have to go to 2% on everything?
I will say something and then hope that it's correct and look to the lawyer to confirm it. Look to Damien. My understanding is that a town would pursue a charter change, and so they could structure their desired tax in any number, any possible permutation, and that charter change would have to be approved by you all.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, your question is if you wanted to go outside of the current local option tax scheme, how would you do that? And the answer is you would do a charter change if there wasn't, if you weren't fitting within the current local option tax. But under current local option tax, you can pick any one of the local option tax options that's there. So, or you can pick all of them or a combination of them. Under the proposed language that I'm going over in a minute, you can also choose to go to 2% on any one or all or any combination of them. So there's, within the local option tax scheme, you have options. You don't have to do it for everything.
I thought you didn't have to go to charter change for local option tax. Was that for adding on?
If you wanted to, so for example, Burlington has a gross receipts tax. So I may have misunderstood your question, but what I understood was that if you want to go outside of what local option tax allows you to do under the current law, then you do need allowance in your charter. Municipalities are limited to what the law permits, absent a charter change. So if you want to do something different than what the law permits, you do need a charter change. Within the law itself, though, you can adopt any permutation that's permitted under the law. The local option tax doesn't require you to do local option tax on everything that's available. You can pick and choose within that.
That was Damien Leonard.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, for the record, I'm Damien Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel.
It's only-
Not enough coffee this morning.
And now that you're on the record, Damien, is there a limit, from understanding of Representative Burke's question or part of it, is it limited only to 1%? Can a town do 2% now without a charter change? Can they, every town is limited to 1% on all of on the multiple options? They're
Right,
all
so if you-
limited to 1. You can't go to 3 if you,
Right,
unless you change.
Say you wanted to do like Massachusetts has, where they have a 3% surcharge on short-term rentals. You would need a charter change to do that. You cannot do that within the local option tax scheme. Even if you wanted to just do a 3% additional sales tax. Current local option tax scheme limits you at 1%.
Thank you.
That's helpful, thank you.
Thank you for the clarification.
But the route that people will take is a charter change, which is a variance from state law. And I would just say, I think it becomes very hard to say to a community that comes to the legislature with a charter change, you can't go to 2% when you already have Burlington and Rutland that are outside of the general law. And Burlington is significantly higher than that. So I think it becomes we're on a slippery slope. And if we don't set rules now, and I'm speaking for myself, if we don't take a look at this and set rules now, we're in a position where communities are going to be coming with charter changes to do this. And it's hard to say no when we already have examples of people above.
Representative Townsend. Let's check that.
Thanks. Really appreciate the presentation. I'm gonna be sharing it with my select board. We have this local option out, you know, as a vote this year. And this is a great explanation. Being on the transportation committee, I can't help but when I see revenue somewhere that doesn't seem to be claimed, like what's happening. So the pilot has got extra revenue in there and by legislation, does it say where that goes?
It stays in the pilot special fund. I will note that, right, in both Act 27 and then the House passed version of the BAA, 790, right, there were additional uses considered for pilot special fund revenue. There was a $500,000 appropriation to the Department of Taxes to implement an inventory of commercial property that's being placed on the grand list. As a result of legislation from a few years ago, there is a shift in payment for the per parcel fees to help municipalities maintain their grand list. That's $3.4 million. And so I think as the chair mentioned in the lead up to the conversation, right, there have been more recently, right, there are uses here and there envisioned for pilot special fund revenue. But yeah, so there's no provision in law that the revenue that goes into the pilot special fund has to be used for anything. Aside from in law, there is a specification that it should be used for pilot payments, but you all can choose to not withstand that requirement.
And those the requirement for those pilot payments now, it's sort of fixed. I mean, there's not a lot of new state buildings getting built. So, you know, the values will slowly go up, but it's almost a fixed.
And there, I will also add, because of the calculation that we talked about earlier, because the value of state-owned buildings is being multiplied by the CLA, and we're seeing CLAs drop because of increases in property values, that's putting a natural kind of governor on pilot payments. And so it's unlikely that we'll see large increases in pilot payments, both because, you know, the state is not going out and acquiring a bunch of property, and also because of the influence of the TLA in the pilot calculation.
Thank you.
Would it be possible to look at those years of not fully funding, that there's a significant amount of towns out there with pilot in effect that would be sitting on some IOUs that might have expected that money to make up for all those years that they weren't funded at 100%?
You could certainly investigate that.
So we took their money and now we have a surplus. We didn't pay them what they were owed before, and now we have a surplus, but we're not having any discussion about, you know, making up for the years that we shorted them.
That would certainly be a policy choice.
That's what I thought.
Thank you.
I would just recommend the Vermont League of Cities and Towns has very strong perspectives about the use of the pilot funds and proposals for how it could have supported municipalities and how it could support them moving forward. So if you're going down that, there has been that conversation, Representative Walker. Not that bluntly, I would say, but.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I support your idea and initiative. I'm concerned that we're devaluing the properties before we even provide a pilot, just by using the insurance number rather than the grand list number. So, and there have been years not providing it. I'd like to know, and I know this is kind of off of transportation, but something on my list is I'd like to know how we, when we haven't had the funds to pay all the pilots, how have we prioritized the funds? I think that would be good to know. And just the basic structure of we're getting the funding from the towns, and then that's what we're using for the state to pay its property taxes to the towns. And it just feels cannibal-like. So I know that's out of this committee, but it's something I'd like to know. So thank you for bringing that.
I think I would just say that the proposal that we started to talk about is going from 1% to 2%. What you're talking about is the base pilot payments. The question really is, we're on the precipice of towns like Stowe talking about expanding beyond the 1%. And if that is what's going to be on the plate, how would you divide that money up? This is not anything about in the proposal that has been in front of our committee. I think at this point, it would be a good time for Damien to come up and explain what we talked about and as a starting point, and this is only meant to create a conversation.
Morning. More record again, the Office of Legislative Counsel. This time I've actually remembered myself. So I've got a request in to share my screen here, and I'll take you through the bill. I only have about 10 minutes till you're scheduled to adjourn, so I just want to offer to make myself available to the House Committee that has not seen this language before at your convenience. To come up and do a more in-depth walkthrough. So the language here would create a new section 24 VSA 138A. So 24 VSA 138 is the existing local option tax. This creates a new section next to it. And the key piece here is in subsection A, a municipality that already assesses a local option tax may impose an additional 1% local option tax on one or more of the tax bases on which it currently imposes a local option tax. So if you have a local option tax on just sales, you can just impose 1% more on sales. If you have it on all of the different bases for local option tax, then you can pick and choose. You could choose all of them, you could choose just one. It allows municipalities to tailor the additional local option, what's this draft is calling the local option municipal services tax. It would provide that the tax would be recommended and approved using the same process as the existing local option tax. So this starts with a vote by the legislative body of the municipality to recommend a local option tax. And then it requires a vote by the municipality's voters at a regular or special meeting that's warned for that purpose. So frequently this is town meeting day. It can also be election day. It can also be a special meeting or election held at another time of year. And then a majority of the voters who are present and voting in that election can approve the tax. So if you have low turnout, you can have a fairly small portion of your municipality's voters approve it. It just depends on how many people have turned out, then you need a majority of those people. The tax would be collected and administered in the same manner as a local option tax under section 138. And this is getting back to our discussion of charter changes versus local option taxes here. Ted talked a little bit about administrative simplicity. This does tie things into the current administrative structure that we have for local option taxes. So you do avoid the chance that each tax is tailored slightly differently with slightly different administration. So this would keep things on the same track, and it would also treat the sale of aviation jet fuel and taxes collected on that in the same manner. We have to do that because of federal law. So aviation jet fuel sales tax has to go back to aviation purposes. And then on a quarterly basis, as was discussed earlier, 50% of those taxes would be paid back to the municipality without a reduction for the costs of administration and collection. 40% of the remaining taxes would be deposited in the local option municipal transportation special fund, which is set up in section 2. And any remaining revenue would be deposited into the pilot special fund. Revenues received by the municipality would be expended for municipal services only and not for education expenditures. And this tracks the existing local option tax language. Initially, when local option taxes were enacted, they were enacted out of Act 60 to allow municipalities to raise additional taxes. This resulted in additional lawsuits about how municipalities that had high tourist traffic or a large workforce coming to them daily could generate more money than other municipalities, resulting in unequal educational outcomes, which is why we have this language in here to prevent some municipalities that have higher taxing power from being able to do that. But you can direct this to municipal services, whether that is transportation, police, fire, recreation, water, any of those municipal services. And so municipalities can tailor it to their needs. The special fund here is a standard special fund. The purpose of the fund is to provide additional state aid for town highways pursuant to the town highway grant chapter, which I'll go into in a moment. Receipts would consist of the percentage from the local option municipal services tax, any gifts, grants, or contributions made to the fund, and any amounts transferred to the fund by the General Assembly. So General Assembly can add additional amounts to this fund if we have a surplus one year. In addition, the Commissioner of Transportation can seek out grants. So for example, if some billionaire's foundation makes money available for local infrastructure, they could seek out grants to help support that fund. The Commissioner of Finance and Management would be permitted to anticipate receipts to the fund. So in other words, Commissioner of Finance and Management can look at the whole year's and revenue and then issue warrants for grants based on those amounts. So they don't have to wait for the money to come in. And then municipalities or monies in the fund would be used solely to provide state aid and to pay for any costs incurred in administering the fund. I know sometimes we like to forget that there is an accounting cost that goes with all of these funds, but it does need to be covered, and this prevents it from being taken out of the general fund. And then the aggregate amount of the monies appropriated would be limited to 95% of the anticipated receipts. This provides a little bit of a cushion if anticipated receipts are down. It's also worth noting that just like other special funds, you cannot withstand this in any given year. If there is, like is happening with the pilot special fund, a surplus that builds up over time. The next section amends the state aid for town highways. And I'll focus on subsection A and then just highlight the other two subsections it touches on. So subsection A is the general appropriation of general state aid for town highways. This is a formula that is based on different percentage for class 1, class 2, and class 3 roads. So 6% goes to class 1 roads, and I can't remember the split between class 2 and 3. And then the amounts are apportioned to each town based on the percentage of state class 1 roads, state class 2 roads, and state class 3 roads that are in that town. So it can be a very small amount if you have very few roads. It can be a fairly large amount in terms of the fund if you have more mileage. I actually left the apportionment in here. So it's 6% for class 1, 44% for class 2, and 50% for class 3. And then out of those percentages, it's your percentage of the amount of state roads in that class. Monies can be used for highway construction, maintenance, and improvement by the towns. And then, as many of you will remember, we've attached an annual inflationary adjustment to this. So what this would do is it would take the money appropriated from the new local option municipal transportation special fund and add that on top of the base appropriation with that inflator. So you get the base appropriation, which inflates every year depending on the rate of inflation. And then on top of that, there's an additional amount that comes out of this special fund. So very few towns implemented this additional local option tax. You would see a very small amount coming out every year. If more towns implemented it, you could see a larger amount coming out on top. So it's essentially, I don't want to call it a bonus, but it's an additional amount that goes on top of what's there. And then these amounts would not decrease the amount appropriated or be considered for purposes of inflation. So this won't lead to a hyper acceleration. So if, for example, you had a bunch of towns enact this and then they decided to pull back the tax, because you do have that option, you're not stuck with your local option tax, then this would adjust without impacting the base appropriation. Does that make sense? The other two sections that we did the exact same thing for are state aid for town highway structures and class 2 town highway roadway program. And when I say that I just mean that I drafted with Senator Westman to put together this proposal. So this is not something that I am either for or against. I want to make that clear. But I unfortunately have a bad habit of using the we term here, which makes it sound like I am supporting or proposing something. So the language on the table here, if you'll remember, both the town highway structures and class 2 town highway roadway program had the inflationary adjustment added to them last biennium. So again, this would allow the money to be used for those programs without affecting that inflationary adjustment. And I have 1 minute left in my time, but I'll take questions.
When this would take effect, so like Stowe's gonna vote in March, this doesn't take effect till July or even May.
Yeah.
How does that impact those voters?
So the effective date, I have not, in drafting this, added an effective date. That's something that needs to be discussed on this language. The vote in Stowe, I don't know how it's being framed for town meeting day. But you would need the state law authorization to move forward with that amount, even if the town votes it. So, and then you need, generally with the local option tax, you need 90 days after providing notice to the Department of Taxes that you would be implementing, so that they can make adjustments internally and notify merchants, et cetera, that the tax they need to collect and report on their returns is going to be changing. I did forget one thing in here. There's a proposal that's included in this to appropriate $3 million from the surplus and the pilot special fund to fill up or to provide initial funding in the special fund. The municipal transportation special fund that's created pursuant to this proposed language for the first year.
And I'm gonna say you, but when you, I mean Senator Westman. Did you consider any supplanting language, like it would require the municipalities not to supplant funding? So like take this extra money, but then not really increase what they do for the local roads because they just move money around within the municipal budget?
In the initial draft, that was not discussed. That could of course be added. It's important to note that so the state aid for town highways is one where we really have two streams of money. So there's the general state aid for town highways, which gets parceled out across the state. And then there's the money that a town like Stowe or another town that voted to have, or that could vote to have the additional percentage would be bringing in, which can be used for any municipal services at the town's discretion.
I didn't mean that money. I meant the
Yeah.
town highway aid. So that was to increase, they could not actually increase the money they spend on the roads.
Right,
They could just move.
so that gets
Move it around.
into, yeah, it becomes a policy discussion for you. Um. You can conceivably have a couple different ways for that to work, and it's worth noting there are a number of different grant funding streams in there. But these grant funds here, the town could choose to take the money, take local money that they would have had to otherwise raise and use that, for example, for their wastewater plant or something like that. And so I mean, I think that's more appropriately would be a discussion for you, and certainly you could consider adding that supporting but not supplanting language that we use elsewhere. When we intend for it to be used for a specific purpose and to grow the amount of money that municipalities are using for a specific purpose. But if you want to allow flexibility, you may choose to have different language. Thank you. Yeah.
If you have, go and represent White.
So Damien, just so big picture, there's a sense of urgency here because Stowe may be passing this additional local option tax 2%. And if we don't move quickly, we may miss out on being able to direct some of those funds back to municipalities to support road and other infrastructure that is really suffering. And so just making sure I'm understanding that clearly.
So I'm not sure about all the details of the vote in Stowe.
Okay.
So I
But we
want to
don't
be
have
clear
legislation
that
out there about.
we don't have legislation,
50%.
and so if it's to propose to go above the 1% that's allowed now, then they need a charter change to do that. If you put this in place, and I don't know how this vote is structured, and I'm not our municipal lawyer, so I want to be careful here. I'm not sure about exactly what the interplay is between this language and Stowe's vote. But if you the sooner you enact this language, the sooner municipalities can begin taking advantage of it. That said, obviously there are other policy considerations for you as to whether this is appropriate right now and whether you want to move forward with this right now or, delay, give it more thought, et cetera.
But we've already seen, you've shared that both Burlington and Rutland have their own local option tax that they do not share at all back to the state.
So.
And so that ship has kind of sailed. And we've got a current local option tax and we've got a surplus in the pilot. And that pilot does not have specific legislation in terms of how that excess can be used. Do we have an opportunity to pass some legislation to put some guardrails around where that excess pilot money that currently exists, how that is spent?
Well, right now it has a very, very tight guardrail around it. It limits it to being used for the pilot unless we notwithstand it and withdraw some money like it's done in this bill. So you could certainly look at additional legislation that provided additional guidance on what you could use pilot special funds for, but that's a bigger policy question that's sort of beyond the scope of.
Unless we do something that, and look at like what Chair Walker suggested, which is compensating towns that were shortchanged in the
Right.
past, because that's within the current language or
Well,
relevant to it.
so it's relevant to the existing pilot funds law.
Yes.
It is I'll say it's not necessarily an alternative to this, but it's another avenue that you can look at apart from what's in front of you here. And certainly this includes a proposal to use some of that surplus in one way. You could propose other options for using that surplus. It is only about $15 million surplus, right?
At the end of FY 25, it was 15.
Yeah, so it's, as was mentioned earlier, there's $15 million is small in the grand scheme of needs.
And I will, there is about $4 million in the governor's budget for items in the tax department.
But again, I do want to emphasize too that if you want to dig deeper into the pilot special fund, there are attorneys and folks at JFO who know more about the inner workings of that than I do.
When were you?
Well, I know that Representative Powell chatted up too.
No, I'm
Where you're
good.
at with Powell. Representative Lally?
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that there's no limit on what this money can be used for in terms of town roads. Like, for example, could it be, doesn't have to be a paved road,
So
or could it be dirt roads as well?
the money that is used for each of these programs is limited to what it can be used for within that, under each grant program. So if we look at state aid for town highway structures, it's for maintenance and for construction of bridges and culverts, for maintenance and construction of other structures, including causeways and retaining walls, intended to preserve the integrity of the travel portion of class 1, 2, and 3 town highways, and for alternatives that eliminate the need for a bridge, culvert, or other structure. And it goes on. For the class 2 roadways, it's for resurfacing, rehabilitation, or reconstruction of paved or unpaved class 2 town highways. And then and I apologize for the scroll for anyone who's watching the screen. I believe this lays out, oh, there we go. Each town shall use the monies apportioned to it solely for town highway construction improvement and maintenance purposes, or as the non-federal share for public transit assistance. So there are limitations on what the grants can be used for. For towns that choose to collect the additional local option percentage, the 50% that goes back to the town can be used for municipal services generally, apart from education expenses. So that 50% could be used for other municipal purposes, wastewater, sewer, stormwater, police, fire, recreation, et cetera, as the town sees its needs. And so different towns may find with the 50%, if they raise that they have other needs besides transportation, that 40% that goes to this special fund is transportation dedicated. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I would like to very much thank the chair for sharing the, inviting the House to join in this presentation. I know there was some significant value in the local options, and we absolutely appreciate anything that will drive the conversation to help for our town highways. We have such a limited ability within the towns to help address town highway, and if we struggle with T-fund dollars, we certainly struggle in each town to keep up with their transportation needs. So I appreciate the chair inviting us, and I appreciate the conversation to how do we find ways to help our towns.
This is meant to be an opening of a conversation. Nothing led in this. I think we are at a place where there's going to be more communities that try to do local option taxes and go beyond the 1%. And if I will say to you, if the towns that want to go from 1 to 2% start bringing us charter changes, in my estimation, it becomes very hard to say no to them when places like Burlington already have a local option tax. why would we grant a charter change for Burlington and not other communities? That said, how are we going to be fair to the feeder communities around these larger communities that are also starving for budgets? And so this is meant to create a conversation about what's happening with local option taxes. And I would encourage the House to get the tax department in. They will tell a story of numerous towns asking about local option taxes. And this is something we're going to face. And if we don't set parameters now, we're probably going to lose the ability to do that.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening.